Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank the Soufan Center for having us here. It's a super topical subject, and there's been breaking news even this morning that may or may not, depending on how our experts feel, alter the threat perceptions and the threat landscape in the region. It is a topic that, of course, we could talk on for a very long time, but I'm very conscious that we have 45 minutes, and so I will try to set some guardrails that limit the conversation, but you are more than welcome to reach out to our panelists afterward and ask them for more detailed explanations of their position. So the idea is that in the post-October 7th period, there have been many important changes in the Middle East, but we're going to try to focus on three. One is, of course, the destruction of Gaza. The second is the Israeli-Iran war that took place. And the third is what's happened here, which is the arrival on the scene of the second Trump administration. And I'm going to ask each of my panelists to address those three and to take the position of one or two, in one case, major country in the region and examine these three distinct events from the positions of those countries. At one stage, I suggested that they each imagine in their minds that they are the national security advisor of that country advising the leadership. But please don't feel that you have to do that. Chuck, since so many of the lines connect to Israel, I'm going to start with you. From Israel's perspective, could you look at these three main events and talk about how they have changed the threat landscape for Israel in the region?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Bobby was asking us to imagine that we were the National Security Advisor. I was the Deputy National Security Advisor. I could imagine it. I want to run through it quickly on a few different levels, not exactly the way Bobby presented it, but pretty close. First of all, on a purely military level, I can say that Israel has never been stronger. Okay? Hamas was defeated. It wasn't destroyed, but it was defeated militarily. And the Iranian axis of resistance, first of all Hamas, and then Hezbollah was devastated, and the regime in Syria collapsed. And Iran itself was hit very hard. And I would say that it's no longer a nuclear threshold state and won't be for the next few years. On a political level, Hamas is still in power. Israel has not succeeded in destroying them or toppling them politically. And the hostages some of them are still in captivity. And Israel has also failed to formulate, I would say, a realistic plan for the day after. Netanyahu presented a plan a week or two ago, but I don't think it's what I would call a realistic plan for day after. On a strategic level, Hamas's basic objective in this whole thing was to survive. And that's how they define victory. Now, Gaza has been devastated. It's kind of hard to call that a victory. From their point of view, if they survive, it is. And if we have a hostage deal which leaves them in power, which is the only deal that they will probably agree to, that leaves them existing as an organization, then from their point of view, they will have won this war, and to a certain extent, from any point of view. And that's something that Israel can't, or at least has a very, very hard time living with. Israel, again, hasn't presented an endgame, and since that's the case, we may find ourselves in a long-term occupation of Gaza, which I think would be about the worst outcome possible, and to a certain extent, exactly what Hamas wanted to happen. And here's a point for maybe Rami to disagree with me on afterwards, but I would say that the war was the Hamas attack was the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. And probably the end of Palestinian dreams for ever achieving an independent state. That has great ramifications for all of us, for Israel no less than the Palestinians. And we have to start thinking of different paradigms, how to go forward. Israel's international standing is at a long-term, is at a nadir. It's never been worse. And that has long-term diplomatic, military, and economic ramifications. In terms of the relationship with the US, we saw unprecedented levels of cooperation. Under Biden, we had the first cases ever of two defensive operations, joint defensive military operations in April and October during the Iranian missile attacks. And under the Trump administration in June, we had the first case ever of joint offensive operations, in effect, the first joint American-Israeli war. The war postponed what was, I think, an impending crisis in the relationship, which has been bubbling for a number of years, mostly on the Democratic left side, but not entirely. We see some of it on the Republican right among the young people. So the war postponed the crisis. It is there now. The war accelerated and greatly accentuated it. And this has really deep long-term ramifications for Israel because the relationship with the United States is nothing short of existential for Israel. I think Israel's leaders should be in a state of panic over this. They don't seem to be. We see people, an increasing number of people in Congress speaking about making American military aid conditional on changes to Israeli policy, primarily regarding the Palestinians. There was one issue that was always sacrosanct in the bilateral relationship. We had disagreements over the years about everything. One thing that was sacrosanct was military aid. And then I have 1 minute? A little less. So let me just say, so the final comment will then be that the war accentuated the fact that the US is really the only remaining superpower of any significance in the region. The war showed Russian and Chinese irrelevance, basically, to what was happening. A couple of years ago, we thought maybe we were beginning to see the beginning of the Chinese era in the Middle East. They negotiated the Iran-Saudi rapprochement. I don't think that's the case. And on the other hand, American influence, after a number of years of diminishing, is back.
Matt, your role, if you choose to accept, is to be the National Security Advisor to the Islamic Republic of Iran. What does the threat landscape look like from Tehran's perspective?
I love that there's this giggle in the audience. For those who know me, and I spent most of my career countering the Iran threat network, I get to play National Security Advisor of Iran. It's probably not a safe position. We used to joke that the number 3 position in Al-Qaeda was the most dangerous thing in the world. Maybe being the National Security Advisor of Iran is not a particularly safe thing to be right now. I think that there's something that goes against conventional wisdom. I think most people look at Iran right now, they see Iran having lost significant elements of its proxy network, not just what's happened to Hamas and, of course, the devastation of the war that followed, but primarily Hezbollah. Nobody other than this very small network of people who were planning it in Israel, I think, could have anticipated what the Israelis did to Hezbollah and is still ongoing. The fall of the Assad regime and the inability to have that land bridge from Iran across Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, and then the 12-day war that destroyed significant elements of the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and took out a significant number, not only of nuclear scientists, but IRGC commanders and other security and intelligence officials. So I think many people probably look at Iran right now and they see Iran on its back heel, and of course in many ways it is. But I think that we in the West, and I'm a former American official, I'll say we in the US in particular, I think, misjudge our adversaries, whether it's Iran or North Korea, China, Russia, terrorist groups, because we assume they will think and behave like we do. And we assume that if they don't behave like we do, because we're rational actors, that they're being irrational. Now, my wife's a math teacher. There's one type of calculus, but calculus and international relations can be done differently, and it comes down to how you assess risk and benefit. We tend to be very risk averse. and we tend to be willing to assume risk when there's pretty much guaranteed benefit. Our adversaries don't function that way. It does not make them irrational. It makes their calculus different. And so we're constantly caught flat-footed. Surely the Russians aren't going to go into Syria. You could give you 12,000 examples like this. And so I think it's a big mistake to see Iran as down and out. I'm going to leave the nuclear file and whether Fordo was obliterated or not to the nuclear experts. We're talking terrorism today. But I think it's really important to understand that from the Iranian perspective, what they are doing with their proxies has two goals that come down fundamentally to how they understand their revolution. It comes down to being able to export the revolution, and it comes down to being able to defend the revolution and being able to do so beyond the border of Iran. Right after 9/11, I worked 9/11 at the FBI. We kept saying, we're fighting the terrorists over there, so we're not fighting them here. There's an element of Iran feeling that way too, and that offensive activity, therefore, in their mind is also defensive. It's protecting the revolution. And to the extent that the Iranians believe, and they have good reason to believe, that the revolution is under threat internally, whether it's protests over forced hijab or what have you, externally, their allies are being taken out, their countries are going to war with them and destroying their nuclear program, etc. They will not back down because they need to defend the revolution. They will become more aggressive. So we have seen the pace of Iranian external operations. I maintain an online map and data set of these. It's open access. You can see it at the Washington Institute's website. There's a clear increase in angle and spike that's going on, and we all anticipate that that's going to continue, targeting Israelis, targeting Americans that they believe maybe were involved in the Qasem Soleimani hit, targeting dissidents more than anything else, because to the extent they believe the revolution is under threat, they're going to go out and target those people they think are fanning the flames of dissent and protest and action against the revolution. I think the Iranians, however, really are very rational, and they understand, if you'll allow me, Chuck, one comment as I understand the Israelis, I think they understand that October 7th changed one huge thing for the Israelis, and Israeli officials have even made this comment explicit this morning in the context of the strike against Hamas leaders in Qatar. And that is that Israelis will know, and I think it's really probably the only thing that Israeli society and politicians agree on in a deeply divided political Israeli society, and that is that they will no longer sit back and allow enemies sworn to their destruction to accumulate the weapons and capabilities to someday use to actually carry that out. And they are going to be increasingly aggressive to do that, to the extent this morning of even carrying out an attack against a Qatar that is politically sensitive for them. This is Qatar. This is not Iraq. This is not Syria. And so I think that moving forward, as the national security advisor of Iran, actually, my advice is going to be double down. We don't have a choice. Do we or do we not support the revolution? This is a revolution. So my answer is, I'll leave the nuclear side to the nuclear people, but we have to rebuild our proxies. Whether or not we'll be able is another story. And we have to rebuild our ballistic missile capability, which I think actually is among the three things that I think led the Israelis to carry out the 12-day war when they did. Significant and fast movement on the nuclear file, the proxies, and a plan to build 8,000 ballistic missiles in 2 years. I think the ballistic missiles is the one thing people underestimated and underappreciated leading to the war. Thank you.
Devorah, a lot of your work focuses on Syria and Iraq, and these are countries that 20 years ago, these were the biggest parts of the threat landscape in the Middle East, and now they're often overlooked. They seem like they're in the sidelines. But if you are in Damascus or if you're in Baghdad, what do the three changes I mentioned at the top, what, if anything, do those mean for you?
Is this working? No. No. Perfect. I think that's a great question, but I would start with Syria. and I wouldn't say even what's in Damascus, because we have a divided Syria. There isn't a united Syria. Even the new interim government in Damascus doesn't control all of Syria. If we think about US counterterrorism policy even, or international coalition counterterrorism policy over the last decade, it's been divided. There's the countering Assad policy, which was very much stalled and failed because of being propped up by Russia and Iran. And then there was the counter-Islamic State policy, the counterterrorism policy that primarily focused on the Islamic State. First the insurgency, and then the detention centers, which is still very much unresolved. But also the rise, as Matt mentioned, the rise of the Iranian land bridge through Iraq and Syria very much impacted Syria today. I think it's very important, we talk about October 7th, we talk about everything that happened in the last 3 years. And one of those is the fall of Assad, that everything went wrong at the perfect time, that everyone was distracted by other obligations, be it Israel attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon, and so Iran being distracted, be it Russia being bogged down in Ukraine. And so when Assad asked for help, there was no help to be given, and we had this kind of perfect storm that emerged. And there was a lot of questions about who would this new government turn to? Many of us were trying to encourage the US government to engage with this new government for this first time. It is not Assad. We have this new actor. That's not to say that there are not things that should be put in place, certain guardrails that should be put in place, but there is at least something new for the first time. And so in Syria, there was a lot of initial feelings of hope. We can create this new government, this new country that can rebuild on the back of the horrible things that Assad did to this country and that Islamic State did to this country and start again. And I think that there is still a lot of hope, but there are still so many security concerns and challenges. I think there is no united Syria. The new interim government has proven itself in some ways and in many ways has failed to unite, to find any sort of accountability. First questions about the Alawite community, then the Druze, and now the SDF. There are so many unknowns in Syria itself, and that's not even touching on the rebuilding, the humanitarian issues, water, electricity issues as well. And Baghdad really needs to prove, Damascus needs to prove its ability to unite and govern. And part of that is working with the Syrian Democratic Forces. The threat of ISIS is not gone. It is not maybe necessarily the sexiest thing that people are talking about and the top of everyone's tongues like they were in 2014, 2015. But ISIS isn't gone. The insurgency is down. It's not out. And the detention centers are still holding thousands of people. We have 27,000 in Al-Hol, 2,500 in Roj, another 9,000 in detention facilities, of which about 10,000 which are third country nationals. And so there's all these questions of what happens if we don't deal with this issue. And so I think the questions very much remain about, whether Damascus can unite the country and address the post-Assad accountability, or if instability in undergoverned spaces are going to allow Iran or Russia or China to come in and influence, if it's going to allow the Islamic State to resurge, or even another jihadist actor. I think about this a lot. I think that ISIS doesn't have a lot of goodwill in society, in Syria or in Iraq, and so it might not be ISIS that reemerges and resurges, it might be another jihadist group. Which then gets me to Iraq, which is very not talked about these days. I think about Turkey's influence in Syria right now and how excited Turkey is, but not all neighbors of Syria are excited about what's happening. Israel is very not excited and has carried out a number of airstrikes in Damascus, but so is Iraq. And Iraq is not happy with the new government. They take the same mentality of Israel, the devil you knew is better than the devil you don't. And so they see the fall of Assad as a terrifying threat on their border at the same time that they are dealing with increased Iranian influence. Iran feels like it's lost Syria, so they're increasingly influencing in Iraq. It's also at a time where Iraq is trying to figure out its own autonomy, rightfully so. After many, many years of other countries being involved in its politics, it's trying to figure out how to define itself as a country. It's still rebuilding from the Islamic State. It did an amazing job at working with the coalition and fighting the Islamic State. And they've also done a really great job on repatriation. So again, I mentioned those detention camps in Syria. The largest group of those detained in those camps were Iraqis. And since 2021, the Iraqis have repatriated more than 23,000 people. which is an incredible number. And a lot of that is also at risk because the funding for repatriation, stability programs, all of that was coming from the US. And so as they are starting to reevaluate their relationship with the US due to Iranian pressure, their own autonomy, they are also dealing with a new relationship with the US. They asked for a bilateral relationship rather than a coalition relationship. So the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS has set a timeline to end in federal Iraq as of this month, September of 2025. So all troops will be out of federal Iraq. The troops are moving to Iraqi Kurdistan, but they will not be operating in Iraq. They'll be operating only in Syria until 2026. I think one interesting thing I'll say, and I know I'm short on time, is that they initiated that relationship and that change before the fall of Assad. And I think since then, there's been a lot of doubts. There's been a lot of questions. Not only are we trying to fight ISIS, not only are we getting now more pressure because of the Trump administration on Iran that we weren't necessarily getting under the Biden administration, but also we now have this unknown in the north. And so I think if you're looking at Iraq's fears and what they are concerned about on the national security stage, it is absolutely Syria, ISIS, and also how to maintain that kind of I almost want to call it a mommy-daddy relationship between the US and Iran.
Rami, I asked you to represent two quite different points of view. One is the view from Lebanon, and secondly, the view of the Palestinian people. We're in New York in a matter of days, a couple of weeks now. The UNGA starts here. There's a lot of talk of Palestine being recognized by a number of major countries, allies of the US. That will have presumably some bearing. But what do things look like to start with from the Lebanese perspective, and thereafter the Palestinian?
Well, thank you. Thank you to
You see the light on?
Thank you very much. I'm honored again to be invited and glad to be here with a distinguished group of colleagues. I follow up what they said because it kind of comes naturally that they talked about specific countries and pointed out a lot of security threats and changes and things that have happened. If I were to comment on Lebanon and Palestine, which I know well, in my whole life I've been in and out of them, and I'm from Nazareth, from Palestine, I would say that they represent today, along with Syria and Iraq and Yemen and Libya and Somalia and a bunch of other Arab countries, they represent the culmination so far of the last 100 years of our modern history. So to ask what happened since October 23 is important and understandable, but when I look at that and try to answer that, I say, well, what's happened since October 23 is a continuation and an acceleration and an aggravation of what has been going on since 1917, since the beginning of the Zionist-Arabist conflict, the British imperial role in the region and the French, and then the State of Israel and the Arab-Israeli War, Arab independence, and then inter-Arab feuds, and all the things that have been going on for the last 100 years. And the Lebanon and Palestine situations are similar in that they're both dysfunctional states. I mean, Palestine is not a state, but Palestinian political governance has not worked very well. Lebanese statehood and sovereignty has not functioned very well. They've suffered a lot because of the conflict with Israel, but also because of their internal issues. And I think for us to understand where we are today requires us to take a slightly broader look, which I guess I only have about 2.5 minutes to do that, but basically I would make a couple of points. The modern Arab state, any state, even the wealthy ones, has not functioned very efficiently in responding to the three great requirements of statehood, of stable statehood, which is security and development, real citizenship, rights for the citizens, and sovereignty. On all three counts, most Arab countries have not done very well. And even the ones that are wealthy, as we've seen interestingly in Qatar in the last months, Qatar's been attacked by Israel and by Iran, with limited attacks, obviously, but and they have the American air base there. So the state, the fragile, vulnerable, fragmenting, fraying Arab state is the core dilemma, the core challenge of our region. And that's because when we look at threats, and the title of our panel is Security Threats, Changing Security Threats, the threats that I see are the threats not just to states, and in the terrorism studies that most of you do, you're looking at state terrorism and how to protect your state or your country or your city. What I look at is the individual and the community and the ethnic group and the communal group and the regional group, which is what defines the Arab region. And I'm talking about the Arab region. Turkey and Iran are different, and Israel, of course, is different. But at all levels of security, there is serious and ongoing and mostly worsening deterioration. Education levels, water availability, job opportunities, and the statistics are staggering. I'll just give you a few off the top of my head. Around 70 to 90% of Arab labor is informal labor. People who have no insurance, no guaranteed contract, no social security payment. The vulnerability that is sweeping across the populations of the Arab world is unbelievably visible now and well documented as it wasn't 20 years ago. If you look at issues like poverty and vulnerability, about 65% of all Arabs are vulnerable and poor. They can't cover their monthly basic needs. This leads to marginalization and alienation. People who want to secede from the state. They create Islamic State. They create the Kurdish region. They create South Sudan. Yemen split and came back and split. So these are not stable, functionally efficient states. All of them have water and food deficits that are very, very serious, to the point where massive immigration has been going on. And so those are just a couple of quick examples. The culmination of this is that you have a state like Lebanon has a constant array of crises, whether it's Hezbollah emerges to challenge the state because the state couldn't defend the whole country. Israel and Hezbollah fight. But Israel was attacking Lebanon before Hezbollah because there was PLO bases there. So everything in the region, not everything, but most trends of war and peace in the region, and you can see this in the Yemeni situation with Israel today, or the Iranian one, go back to the discontent of two major issues. The century of Zionism, Arabism conflict, the modern state of Israel and the Arab countries, and the resistance movements. And the second is nonstop foreign military intervention, which used to be mostly the British and the French, but then the Russians were involved in many times, the Iranians get involved, the Turks are now involved, and now the Israelis are involved militarily in many Arab parts of the Arab region. So those are just quick headline points that I would make for the Palestinians and the Israelis, is they basically have to just wait this out, because they can't do anything on their own given the might of Israel with the United States, and things will change. And the archaeology books that I write about the Middle East tell me that things always change, and the change can start abroad. Maybe American elections change, maybe congressional balances change, who knows? We see that happening, but wait it out, keep doing what you can to keep giving your people their basic needs. And when resistance movements emerge, figure out if these resistance movements can have any practical impact that helps you. Otherwise, just wait it out.
Right. So you mentioned headlines. I asked each of you to take a fairly high altitude view, and now we have to come right down to the ground, to the events of today, of this morning. I'm curious to know your thoughts on whether the threat landscape significantly changes when Israel crosses another Rubicon and attacks targets in Doha. And you mentioned it, Matt, in your opening remarks. Can you very briefly expand on that? What changed this morning, if anything?
Impunity. A few days ago, I posted to X, formerly Twitter, a picture of senior Hamas leadership meeting in a very, very fancy hotel-looking room with the visiting Iranian foreign minister and others, and just tweeted saying, someone explain to me why the Qataris are allowing them to meet in luxury and in public. If the United States and others are saying Qatar is supposed to, we need them for this mediator role, it should at least be like in quiet, not in luxury. And apparently I wasn't the only one asking this question. Now, anybody who paid close attention heard that the former head of the Shin Bet in Israel said many, many months ago that the Hamas leadership living in luxury in Doha, people who were at a very bare minimum fully aware of the October 7th plan and worse, are not going to be allowed to remain there unmolested. No, I don't think people should have been surprised. I don't think that this means the Israelis are going to go just whack everybody that's on their list at any given time. I think there was a precipitant event. This was going to happen anyway. It's not why it happened, but the precipitant event was a terrorist attack in Jerusalem, which Hamas just claimed credit for. But I think that, again, as I said, the Israelis are clear. They're done. If a country like Qatar won't deal with the Hamas guys in their country and tamp them down, put pressure on them to release hostages so that war can end. And of course, Netanyahu needs to be pressured too. There's two sides to this, to be clear. Then they're going to take action on their own. I'll disagree with Rami just to start off the pleasant and amicable disagreements. I would say that waiting it out, I don't know if that's an option for Palestinians or for Lebanese who are living in this poverty you described. And I certainly don't think an option is, well, let's see if the resistance groups can help you. I don't think the resistance groups are there to help these people. Hamas has been very, very clear. We didn't do what we did to improve the condition of people in Gaza. They did what they did because they were afraid of Saudi-Israeli normalization, of being sidelined. They didn't do this because there wasn't a two-state solution. They did this because there was the prospect of progress towards a two-state solution. And maybe I've just been involved in this for far too long and I'm vested, and maybe I'm just a stubborn bastard, but I refuse to give up on the two-state solution.
But you felt, Chuck, that the two-state solution is dead and buried?
Well, first of all, we're not talking about resistance movements. I don't accept the terminology. We're talking about terrorist organizations. Resistance movements use political means. These are organizations that use primarily mass murder of innocent civilians, and we saw that yesterday in Jerusalem when 6 people were killed and 20-something were wounded. And there is no justification for that kind of behavior, for murder. I'm here maybe a little bit less optimistic than Matt that Israel will be able to implement what is a fully understandable policy. I mean, I fully support the idea of no longer being willing to tolerate buildup of these kinds of threats because there's a limit to how often you can do it. And so now we're just 2 years in, and Israel succeeded in a dramatic victory. No one, I think, expected this in defeating the Iranian Axis. And yes, we're continuing to hit Hezbollah, and there's the war is still ongoing with Hamas, and there's back and forth with the Houthis, and today it was in Doha. But there's a limit to how many places and how often you can do it. I think the good news is that the war showed that terrorist organizations, despite the common wisdom, terrorist organizations can be defeated by conventional militaries. Maybe you can't destroy them completely, but they can be defeated. And Hamas today is a shadow of what it was.
Well, there are elements of the resistance axis at large in Iraq, Devorah. Should they be worried after today's attacks in Doha? Should they feel less impunity?
Well, I'll start with, I'd like to disagree with Chuck. I don't think that terrorist organizations can be defeated through military action alone. A terrorist ideology is about the ideology. It lives on in people. It is about the idea that exists. We think about that. I would almost use the example of Al-Qaeda, which never held physical territory, but the idea of it still exists. And so you cannot defeat it through military action alone. But to your question about the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq or in Syria that still exist, yes. And I think that the part of the transition to a bilateral relationship with the U.S. And one of the things that I don't necessarily think the Iraqis really accounted for under the Trump administration was the lack of tolerance towards the relationship with Iran. And they have tried to test it with the PMF law, which the U.S. said, absolutely not, this is not okay, we are not going to legitimize this. There was questions about using Iraqi territory to fire towards Israel. Again, shut down and operations there. I think that the U.S. and Israel have made it clear that there are no safe spaces for this, and it's going to lead to some accountability in both Syria and Iraq to kind of think about how are we going to engage with people who the U.S. and their allies don't necessarily want us to be talking to.
Rami, how do the events of today change perceptions of threats in the Arab world? I mean, Doha or Qatar is home to one of the largest American bases in the world. You know, America has radar installations there and elsewhere in the region. Should have seen this attack coming, but it apparently did not until it was told very late in the day that it was coming. The Qataris were blindsided. If you were sort of in charge of these decisions in Qatar or in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, does it change your perception of the value of having American bases in your country if they can't protect you from attack by Israel?
No, I don't think that would happen. And I don't think the attack was against Hamas officials. It wasn't against Qatar. So, and when the Iranians attacked, they also, it wasn't a real attack. The Arab governments, despite the many, many good things they've done, and if you look at the development of the Arab region from the 30s till the 80s, it was spectacular. They had faster growth rates in education than East Asia did, Japan and other. So the Arab governments did many good things for their people. But around 1990, they stopped being able to do good things. They ran out of money, they ran out of legitimacy, they ran out of credibility. Their best young people immigrated. So the Arab governments have essentially become de-sovereignized. They just don't have the sovereign power to make big decisions without the approval of some foreign power. It used to be Britain and France. Now the US plays a role. Could be Iran, could be somebody else, Turkey. They have great vulnerability. So the governments don't really have a role to play very much, and we've seen their reaction to what's going on in Gaza. They have done nothing much besides issue statements and do some airdrops. So I wouldn't look to the Arab governments. I think the issue of resistance, which Chuck mentioned, I think others, it's really important. The resistance doesn't mean necessarily having arms like Hezbollah or attacking civilians like the bus stop in Jerusalem. Those are forms of military action, terrorism, military resistance, whatever you want to call it. But there's many other forms of resistance. And the Arab people have probably among the world's greatest reservoir of resisting oppression, either by their own people, by neighboring powers, or foreign powers. And they're still doing it over and over. And when you look at polling in the Arab region, and we now have good polling all over the region, it shows you that something like 80% of the Arab people think that Israel and the US are their greatest security threats, which is quite extraordinary. Iran is close after them. So the point I'm making is that at some point, the 470 million Arabs, as well as the however many million, I don't know what Iran is, 400 million, 500 million, those people, the average people must have at some point some impact on their country, their policies, their governance, their values, and how they live. And that hasn't happened yet. The Iranian revolution is not necessarily representative of its people. None of the Arab governments really are representative fully of their people, and this creates the stresses and tensions, which is one of the reasons why we've reached this point. So historically, people have turned in on themselves, protected themselves as well as they can, their family, their community, their sect, whatever, and then they understand the march of history.
So we're down to less than 2 minutes, and so I'm going to impose this very strict thing on all of you. Let's turn this whole question on its head and ask, we've talked about the threat landscape since October 7th. The question I want to ask each of you is, what is the likelihood now of the threats predating that event, pre-October 7th, being restored? So the resumption of the ISIS, the sort of the reformation of Hezbollah, the reemergence of Hamas. If you had to handicap the likelihood of that happening, what were the chances? I'm going to start with you, Rami, and then work backwards across.
I think there's very little chance of going back to before October 23. There has to be significant changes in Arab countries. There has to be a definition and containment of Zionism in its military form in the region and what it does, so that the Jewish people of Israel can live a decent life as they're entitled to, and the Palestinians have to have their rights. It won't be in 2 states, probably. It'll be some other arrangement. And the rest of the region has to go on at some point and deal seriously with the process of giving their citizens basic rights in order to live a normal life. The Turks kind of tried it about 15, 20 years ago and then pulled back. The Tunisians got the closest, and then the powers closed in on them. So that's what I think. It's going to be major changes coming.
Devorah, is there any going back?
I do think that we're not paying attention, funding, or addressing many of the threats that were in Syria and Iraq before, including the Islamic State. And if we don't actually have policies that put our money where our mouth is for these issues, then yes, Islamic State or another group could come out and resurge.
Chuck?
I think essentially all of the players will rebuild over time, and we will face the same threats. We'll gain a few years of a reduced threat level, but I'd like to make 2 quick comments.
Really quick.
Very quick. One is, Rami spoke before about being from Nazareth, Palestine, and he defined Zionism in a totally misguided way. And I think the fact that someone like Rami speaking in this way, almost 80 years after Israel's establishment, is exactly the source of the problem that we face in the region, why we haven't reached a 2-state solution. And I said before that I think the 2-state solution is probably dead, and I say that with great regret because I've been a lifelong supporter of the 2-state solution. But how many times can you try something and fail? And so we don't have time to talk about this, but I believe that we have to look at new paradigms for separating between Israel and the Palestinians.
In a nutshell, I think that the United States, our Israeli allies, we've all gotten very, very good. We're about to have the 9/11 anniversary at tactical counterterrorism, and we've all been historically pretty poor at translating that in strategic victory. The terrorist threats are more geographically diverse, and the ideological spectrum is wider. There are more people on our no-fly and other terrorism lists, exponentially more today than there were at 9/11. On the issue of the security threats in the Middle East, though, I see an opportunity. I can't speak for the politicians who ultimately have to be the ones to really translate tactical success into strategic gain. But I think that Hezbollah and Hamas in particular only become anywhere near what they were if we all collectively completely screw up. And I see opportunities with a new government in Lebanon. I see opportunities with a new government, not a perfect government, in Syria. If, please God, we can get to the end of the war in Gaza, return of the hostages, and the day after in the beginning of a rebuilding, I do see an opportunity for something better.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. As you can tell, we were trying to condense something that was on a giant canvas into a little miniature. I hope we sort of at least got some ideas started in your minds. And again, I invite you to reach out to all the individuals here and ask them more questions over the rest of today and tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
And Bobby.